Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the comparative anatomy of bone tissue. To start, we'll take a look at how bones are structured in terms of their cells and the fibers that are secreted. Then we'll look at how to engineer a bone between two different types, spongy and compact, so that a bone can achieve its function. And finally, we'll turn to marine mammals and do some comparative anatomy with marine mammals and their bone density. When people think of bones, very often people think of dry, inanimate objects, but living bone is very different. Living bone is very much alive, it's complex in structure, it is vascularized, that is, it has lots of blood flow going to and from it, and there's even some nifty little compartments in there to store some extra features, such as bone marrow. From a microscopic level, we can define bone tissue, also known as osseous tissue, as a collection of cells and the matrix those cells secrete. Now, because bone is also known as osseous tissue, many terms use the word osteo as a prefix. So, for example, osteocytes are going to be the cells in the bone tissue that help maintain the matrix. And in this photo here, I actually have a couple osteocytes shown, one of which is circled. So there's an osteocyte, there's another osteocyte. Now, these cells help maintain what most people think of when they actually think of a bone. And what that is the matrix. This extracellular matrix is a combination of collagen fibers and calcium phosphate salts. And the collagen fibers act something like a rope, so you can imagine taking a large piece of rope here that will not stand up on its own, but is really good against pulling motion, and then take a layer of brick and mortar it to that rope, and you essentially have a model of bone matrix. So the calcium phosphate is like the brick and mortar. Okay, when you get ready to lay down osseous tissue, you can pretty much lay it down into one of two arrangements. You can lay it down very, very compactly and tightly, and if you do that, you create what's known as compact bone, and compact bone looks pretty much like a solid, thick sheet. Or you can lay it down in a porous manner, and if you do that, it's called spongy bone because of its relationship to looking like a sponge. Now, what type of bone you lay down somewhat depends on the function of that particular skeletal bone. All bones have at least a little bit of both. So there's always going to be at least some compact bone, and compact bone as a rule coats the surfaces of all bones, and spongy bone as a rule is found more internally or inside. And in this picture here, we actually have a really nice cutaway of a skull bone, and you can see the compact bone, or the thick layer, is actually on the outside, and the spongy bone is found on the inside. So the real question is, if you're going to engineer a bone, how much compact bone do you lay down versus how much spongy bone you lay down? And to answer that, we first need to look at the pros and cons of each type of bone. For compact bone, its number one advantage or selling feature is the fact that it's exceptionally strong. In other words, it's very, very good at offering support against a force, particularly a parallel force. I'm going to use a little coffee straw here to kind of help me demonstrate what I'm referring to. If this coffee straw represents a layer of compact bone, then the type of force that this coffee straw is going to be really good at supporting is a force that's pushing down on that coffee straw. A force that does this, not so much. So parallel forces are really great for compact bone. However, they come with a big cost. Compact bone is also very, very dense and therefore very heavy. So rarely are bones 100% compact bone. We can use an analogy here. Imagine for a moment if your radius and ulna, these are going to be the bones that are found in your forearm, were 100% compact bone. That would add several pounds pounds to this area of your forearm. So imagine taping little half-pound weights all the way down your forearm and then having to move your forearm at the elbow joint. It would be really, really difficult, and it would get very tiresome to do so. So because compact bone is so dense and so heavy, we use spongy bone a lot, especially when we don't need to provide a lot of support. So spongy bone's number one advantage is the fact that it's lightweight and it's porous. However, it doesn't offer the same support that compact bone offers against heavy stresses. Now let's take a look at spongy bone in a little bit more detail. Spongy bone is not always arranged randomly. Even in bones that support a good amount of weight, there's usually some spongy bone in there, and they tend to be arranged in kind of a spoke pattern that runs parallel to the major stresses. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. However, bones that support very little weight, the spongy bone tends to be more random in appearance. So based on this picture that's shown on the screen, we can infer that this bone probably doesn't support a whole lot of weight, given that the fact that the spongy bone has a very sponge appearance to it. And indeed it's not. It's a cutaway from a bone on your skull right up here. So your cranium bones don't tend to support a lot of weight. Contrast that to, let's say, your femur. In a human, the femur supports all of the upper body weight. It all gets transferred onto the femur. And what's rather interesting is that it gets transferred more or less in one spot, right here at the top of the head of that femur, right there. And so you might expect, well, there's probably a very thick layer of compact bone there, but in fact there's not. It's a very thin layer. There is, however, a lot of spongy bone, and the spongy bone is going to be arranged in a series of spokes that help that femur support that weight. Coming back over here, I'm going to use my little coffee straws to kind of demonstrate what I mean. We're going to let one of these coffee straws now be a spoke of spongy bone. And so if we try to arrange this spongy bone, I could potentially arrange it in kind of a fanning motion like this. And if I were to do that, what that would tell me is that this bone is getting weight here, 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 and here. In other words, there seems to be an even amount of stress that's coming across this entire surface, and the bone is trying to funnel it down to the base. Alternatively, I could put them all together and arrange them like this, and that would tell me most of the force is coming down this way, and the bone is trying to absorb that stress and transfer it to another part of the bone. So let's actually take a look at a real live femur here, and we'll see what we can see with those spokes. So over here, I'm going to move to a little blow up of the femur that's been bisected. In this case right here, you can see this region is going to be the head. And if you take a look, you'll notice that these spokes of spongy bone are not necessarily arranged in a true spongy pattern, but rather there seems to be some pattern, especially right here. You can see the spokes are arranged in lines. And as they come down, they're arranged in some different lines that all show you that the stress is being transferred to a lower part of the bone here, which has a much thicker ring or sheath of compact bone. So now that we've taken a look to see that the femur doesn't have a random spongy bone appearance, we can come back and see that with this picture here. This picture right here where I've got my pointer circling is showing you the stress load and how the spongy bone is arranged in a spoke pattern to help distribute that weight down to a lower part, such as the compact bone down in the shaft right here. So now that we've looked at how spongy bone is arranged, let's take a look at compact bone. Compact bone, as a rule, is proportional to the weight load that that part of the bone supports. So if there is a large weight load that that bone is supporting, then we expect to see a large percentage of compact bone. So now that we've learned about how to engineer a particular bone, let's turn to comparative anatomy. We're We're going to first look at terrestrial mammals that are very, very large. So this would include elephants and rhinos. And in the picture here on the left, we actually see a woman holding an elephant femur. And you can infer from the way that she's holding it that that femur is very, very, very heavy. This suggests that that femur has a very large percentage of compact bone. In another large land mammal, we can see kind of a cutaway here, and where I've circled it, you can see a cutaway of that femur, and you can see it's almost entirely compact bone. So all of this compact bone shows that these animals are supporting a huge amount of weight on their limbs. So just to recap, let's take a look at some of the rules. The larger the terrestrial mammal, then we assume the more weight that their skeletal system must support. The more weight their skeletal system has to support, the higher percentage of compact bone is used, as opposed to spongy bone. But this in and of itself actually lends itself to a problem because compact bone is very, very dense and therefore very heavy. So the heavier your bones are, the more difficult it's going to be for your muscles to move them, and so the more difficult it's going to be to move around. And if you can imagine rhinos or elephants moving around, they tend to move around rather sluggishly. They're not very fast or quick, in part because their bones themselves are so heavy. But what about marine mammals? Marine mammals, a tale of two densities. In order to look at what marine mammals might do, it's helpful to first see, well, what do aquatic animals do in general? And as a rule, archaeologists have established that aquatic animals have engineered their bones to have a greater bone density than terrestrial counterparts. And to me, this is rather counterintuitive because they don't need to support their weight in water. So if they're in the water, why do they need a greater bone density than terrestrial mammals, since water helps alleviate a lot of the weight? But the answer is not supporting weight, it's to provide density, and that density helps allow them to sink and counteract any air spaces that are in the body, such as lungs or possibly air bladders. And this is very similar to a scuba diver who puts on a weight belt to help them actually sink in the water against the airspace rather than float. So that's the analogy. And so that's a general rule of thumb. In fact, it's so prominent that an archaeologist will take a look at a bone from an unknown animal and basically make a guess as to whether it was terrestrial or aquatic based on the bone density. High bone density means aquatic, low bone density means terrestrial. But what about marine mammals? Well, as it turns out, some marine mammals do follow that general trend, and that includes otariids, which are going to be our fur seals and our sea lions. Their bone density tends to actually be very, very similar to terrestrial mammals, so they kind of follow that general trend. So in other words, they have a greater bone density. But the cetaceans and the phocids do not. They actually have the reverse. Their bone density is going to be lighter than comparatively sized marine mammals. And that's a really interesting idea. Why the bifurcation? Why are otariids heavy and why are cetaceans and phocids light? And with cetaceans and phocids, the answer actually lies in a different part of the body. It lies within their lungs. Cetaceans and phocids, as a rule, have adapted collapsible lungs. Their airspace can completely deflate when they are submerged. So as a result, they don't have an airspace that's keeping them buoyant. And so if they were to have really heavy bones, they would sink far too rapidly to try to stay neutrally buoyant in the water. Otariids don't have that feature. Their lungs do not collapse, and so as a rule, they tend to exhibit more of the aquatic tendency of having heavier bones to help pull them down in the water and counteract the positive buoyancy gained by their lung space. And with that, I'll see you next time.